They'll start letting people in the room shortly, and we'll get started as soon as people are allowed into the session. This is the YWCA Stand Against Racism Virtual Lunch and Learn Legacies of Injustice in Sports. So we'll get started in just a few minutes. Okay, even though we're only 1 minute past the noon hour, we'll get started because people can join us at any point, and we do have a lot to discuss. I see people are still entering the room, but I want to welcome everyone to the YWCA Stand Against Racism series. We'll start off by thanking the Regis Foundation for having the vision of providing support for us to have these discussions. The YWCA's mission of eliminating racism, empowering women, promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all is part of the reason that we do this work, and it's very important work. We like to offer a forum so that people in the Nashville and Middle Tennessee community, and really beyond, since we're on Zoom, we can kind of go beyond the borders of our region to invite them to these conversations. And we want to have a safe space for people to be able to express themselves in their true, authentic selves. Today, I'm very excited because I consider myself an athlete. Now, the folks on this screen are the super athletes. I'm just a baby athlete. My days of competition ended in high school. However, I've continued to compete at a fairly high level. In fact, on the last race that I ran, I actually, when they called my name to get a trophy, it was one of the Titans races. I couldn't believe it was me, but I think after you get so old, you actually get very competitive. Once you get to a certain age and you're still running, you get very competitive. You can get a trophy pretty easily. So I do feel very fortunate that my body has withheld the test of time. But anyway, we're talking today about a subject that's very, very important because there have been a lot of injustices and a lot of confusion around the issue of why athletes feel it is necessary, especially athletes of color, to really get into that space of protesting. And see, I'm old enough to remember the 1968 Olympics, what was viewed as a Black Power salute by Tommie Smith and John Carlos. These two storied athletes were at the Olympic Games, an international competition, and they raised what was viewed as a Black Power salute. They will later say that this was really talking about the various injustices against many people, blue collar workers and others, to the injustices of our society. You have to remember in 1968, in the United States of America, who they were representing on the international space, was in the midst of the civil rights movements. And there were very many injustices suffered by people of color during that same year in the country that they represented. And they wanted their voices to be heard. Now, they were stripped of their medals and suffered many injustices for many years after that. But I think very few people really understood what drove those athletes to make that statement on the international stage, and why was there so much backlash for them really speaking what was their truth at that time. And it was a very brave thing to do. I'm going to ask each of the panel members to introduce themselves and tell about their personal and professional journeys, experiencing, learning about, and witnessing, and even studying the issues of racism and oppression in the realm of sports today, and learning about the histories of injustice that reflect in today's climate. I'll start with Shane Foster.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I am so honored to be a part of this incredible panel with folks who I call family from Vanderbilt University, and certainly just an honor to share space with you all. I am the executive director of Men Together and vice president of external affairs for the YWCA here in Nashville. And prior to that, I had an extensive career in basketball, as I am still currently Vanderbilt University's all-time leading scorer. I played in the NBA, played overseas in Italy, Belgium, and Turkey, got a chance to travel this entire world playing the game that I love. As I think about this topic today, I recall something that happened to me while I was in Belgium. And I had an opportunity after we had won a game to go and hang out with some teammates, and we went to this bar. And we walked into the bar and people started yelling, F USA, F USA, get out of here. We walked out into the parking lot. I'm scared. I'm in another country. I don't know what's getting ready to happen, but I'm surely not going to stay in this space. And we walk outside and some guys followed us outside and they looked me dead in my face and said, F you, you American. I'm scared. But at the same time, in reflecting on this moment, I realized this was the first time in my life at 24 years old, first time in my life, I was called an American. Every other time I've been Black, I've been African-American, but I was only American in this particular context. When I think back to my American experience, especially playing the game of basketball, sure, I've had coaches who off their own tongues have been very belittling, very vulgar in their language, and even some cases uttering things that are considered racist. The same individuals who loved me, the same individuals who sacrificed to come and pick me up to go to practice and to drop me off after games. I had stayed in their homes and they had helped me in so many ways, but that didn't stop their language. That didn't stop how they treated me, and most importantly, how they treated my other teammates who wasn't scoring 20 points a game, who looked just like me. This concept of protesting is not just about protesting injustice, it's also about protesting our own life experiences. Because often playing a sport is deemed entertainment. And oftentimes we're in spaces where the same ones who celebrate us are the exact same ones who are oppressing. And that has certainly been a part of my story as well.
All right, well, Dr. Lee, Candice.
Thank you, Sharon. And first, I also want to thank the YW for putting on this event and including me. You all do great work, and I've been really blessed to just be a part of it as a board member, and just so happy with all of the great things you're doing in the community. And I also have to say, I mean, Shane is the only one up here that holds records of any type at Vanderbilt. So he's probably the only super athlete. Okay, so I'm just gonna go ahead and say that, and we all know it. I will be brief because I think that we've got some great topics to cover, and this is really important. But I would say, you know, I have been the athletic director permanently at Vanderbilt for about 10 months. And it strikes me often that, you know, the first Black female in this conference, and that's a very humbling thing, but it's also very frustrating in that I know that there are competent people that look like me that deserve opportunities. And because of so many barriers that are in our way, that has not come to fruition very much. I would say that, you know, I've been thinking about this a little bit, and I had a conversation with a high school friend. I grew up military family, grew up and moved a lot, but went to high school in North Alabama, and my parents retired there, so they're still there. And so I was talking with this high school classmate and friend, and we talked about just how volatile the social climate is right now, but how blessed we are that we had a wonderful experience in North Alabama. So in high school, it was such a warm community, very diverse. And as I thought about the ways that I've encountered racism, both overtly and covertly, for me, the majority of those experiences have been at Vanderbilt. And that is probably surprising, right? To some people. I've been blessed to be here for 25 years, obviously love the place, came here as a student athlete and have 3 degrees from here. And yet there are still times where I have to prove that I belong. And I think that that's a really important message because even someone like me, right, who appears to be in, the pinnacle of, in the career trajectory and still has to fight to be comfortable in an environment where I technically have grown up. And I think that that's just an indication of how much work there is to do. And it's something that we can't lose hope about, because if we do that, we'll stop. But we do have our work cut out for us. There is absolutely no doubt.
Andrew?
Well, Sharon, I also want to thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel with 2 people that I consider really close friends, Shan and Candice. Candice was modest. She was quite the basketball player here too. I was quite the intramural softball player though. So, I want to make sure that I get some, credit for that intramural career that I had here at Vandy. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about racism in the context of sports also, and you asked about our personal journeys to this place. For me, learning about race and racism has always been through the lens of sports. I can remember my grandfather and my dad, when we're watching games saying, we do not root for the Boston Red Sox because they were the last team to desegregate, or if we're watching bowl games when I was a little kid, like we would always root for the Big Ten. You do not root for an SEC team when I was growing up, because they were the last to desegregate. And so when I came to Vanderbilt, I think it was probably a little disappointing to my family, and so that was one of the reasons why I was so interested to learn about the story of Perry Wallace when I was a sophomore here at Vanderbilt. I didn't know that there was a student here, 20 years before me who had been the first African-American player in the conference. And I was taking a Black history class at that time, taught by Dr. Yolette Jones, so I had a Black woman professor teaching this class. And I learned about Perry that year, my sophomore year. I was 19 years old. And I asked her if I could write a paper about Perry for her class. And I thought she was going to say no, that we don't talk about sports in college. You don't just write about basketball players. That's not serious enough. And that's why I love the theme of this panel, because it is serious enough. And I think that sports is sort of accessible to so many people, no matter how old you are, whether you're rich or poor or Black or white, man or a woman, like people pay attention to sports. And so I think it's a really good venue to talk about these issues. And so my first real exposure to learning about the depths of racism that all people, but especially athletes, experience was through that paper that I first wrote about Perry, and then turned that into a book about Perry Wallace 17 years later. And Perry also had this phrase that he used to use about, in his life, he had many mentors, but also many, M-I-N-I, mentors, and he would take advantage of even just, one conversation with someone to learn. And so I think about people like Coach Ed Martin, who was here, who I had a chance to learn from, Buck O'Neill, the Negro League baseball player that I met when I was working for the Tampa Bay Rays, Perry, Godfrey Dillard, David Williams, Richard Baker, who for 50 years was the only Black employee at the athletic department. I got to know him. Eddie Robinson, when the Grambling team played a game at Vandy, I interviewed him. And so I feel really fortunate to have learned in those sort of mini mentor sessions from some really brilliant people.
All right, thank you. I'll go back to Andrew with this question. Everyone is familiar, it's been, a sort of a lightning rod issue of athletes protesting during the national anthem and other parts of sports. They've used their voice, at all different levels, whether that's professional, college, high school, probably even Little League, if you were really reading the stories. And we've seen a significant backlash as people who are studying, whether it's athletes or really followers of athletics, about the protests and the reaction, the backlash, so to speak. In other words, how do you react to the sort of shut up and play or be my entertainment attitudes? I'll start with you, Andrew.
Sure. So, one thing I do besides working here at Vanderbilt is I write books about sports and social justice for young people, high school, middle school students. I turned Strong Inside into that type of book. I wrote one about the first U.S. Olympic basketball team at the Nazi Olympics in 1936. I have a new book now about the first openly gay Major League Baseball player. And I think the lessons of history in all of those books are the danger of being neutral, or the danger of remaining silent in the face of injustice. So if you're going to say that the lesson of the civil rights movement is that you, as a white person, like, you need to get involved, you need to stand up for other people, right? Or if you're going to say that the lesson of the Holocaust was the danger of neutrality, that's what Elie Wiesel said, that he swore never to be silent in the face of injustice. Like, you have to stand up. Neutrality is always on the side of the oppressor, never the oppressed. So if the major lesson of these pivotal moments in history is that you have to speak up and use your voice, use your platform, then how do you criticize an athlete for doing just that, when they have such large platforms in our society and the ability to influence so many people by what they say, and they've experienced these things in their own lives. So I think it's disingenuous to say that they should just stay in their lane, and that they don't have a right to speak up like any other person.
Candice?
I would agree with Andrew. And, I think that it's interesting that people want to support athletes, when they're cheering for them, when they're entertaining them or playing their sport, but they forget that these are whole people that have experiences and perspectives, and they don't just stop being who they are because they put on a uniform. And I don't think that we ask anyone else to stop being who they are when they're exploring their craft or they're in their professional space. Like, we don't ask you to bring only half of yourself. We ask you to bring your whole self. So it strikes me that when we talk very broadly about authenticity and we value the whole person, but we want to take athletes and put them in a box if we don't agree or don't understand where they're coming from. I was in a workshop the other day that was talking about the importance of compassion as it relates to leadership, and it talked about empathic listening, and it said, you can actually, or empathic understanding, I'm probably butchering the term now, but the point was that you can not fully understand where someone's coming from, but you can want them to be free from suffering. Like, I may not fully understand what you've experienced, but by gosh, I shouldn't want you to hurt. And I think sometimes we don't look behind to figure out why. I had a number of conversations with people in our community who genuinely were frustrated that we had student athletes who were using their platform. And I recall this one conversation, and I mean, you try to approach these conversations with curiosity and not judgment. As a Black woman, I'm also, as a leader, I'm also trying to understand it and not put my personal lens in there. And you want to be approachable and engage people in conversations, even when it feels personally difficult. But I recall this one conversation that I recently had with a woman who was upset with what some of our student athletes had done. And by what they had done, it just meant using their platform and protesting. And I shared a couple of things that those student athletes had shared with me about what they had experienced right here on campus. And this person was blown away and said, "So you mean to tell me even when you make it to Vanderbilt, that kind of thing happens?" And then asked me if those things had ever happened to me. And we ended up having a beautiful conversation where we really heard each other. And obviously, like, those kinds of things take time, and we need to have more conversations like that. But there are still so many things that are happening to young people, and we're not taking the time to understand why they feel they have so much to say. And I think that'd be an important step for us.
All right, Shan?
Wow, hearing Andrew and Candice talk about this really brings me back to my college experience and time I spent at Vanderbilt. And when I think about that phrase, shut up and dribble, shut up and play, I was fortunate enough to be in a position where this community really welcomed me in with open arms. And for 4 years, I probably did more community service than any other athlete in our program, because every time someone asked me to go and speak at their school, go speak at their church, go speak, come just spend some time with their young child, I always went. And it's only when we speak out about injustice and racism in particular that the expectation is, no, you need to shut up. When what I do is beneficial to you, to family, to business, to education, we recognize the platform of sport and we embrace the platform of sport. But when it comes to racism, we want to push that to the side, not realizing that if I shut up and dribble, then my little brother doesn't get an opportunity. If I shut up and dribble, then those who are coming after me are still being brutalized unfairly by police. If I shut up and dribble, then young boys in Nashville are not learning about healthy manhood and respect for women and girls. If I shut up and dribble, then the next person who's coming to experience Vanderbilt University in Nashville is experiencing the same injustices that I have and that Perry Wallace has and that Candice Storey Lee has. So we can't afford to shut up and dribble. There's a cost associated with us not speaking up and talking about these experiences. And I will never forget a few years ago, my wife and I, we were at a basketball game and someone came up to me and they embraced me, gave me a big hug, talked about all the games. They had seen my senior night performance and we had a great moment. And my wife is standing right there and they looked, they said, "Oh, is that your wife? Give me a hug," and hugged her and loved on her. And the moment they walked away, my wife said, "That's the same woman who came up to Nordstrom when I was working there and said, I don't want to be served by a Black woman." That hurts.
Mm-hmm.
And when we say shut up and dribble, what we're saying is we don't care about your hurt. We don't care about your pain. We don't care about what's happening to your family. Oftentimes when I get pulled over by police, even here in Nashville, the conversation oftentimes is, "I'm sorry, Mr. Foster, I didn't know it was you. Have a good day." But what about when someone they don't recognize is the one in that seat? What if that's my little brother who wears dreads and is not in a suit and tie and doesn't have Vanderbilt on the back of his vehicle? What about them? And we have to continue having these conversations.
Wow, okay. Thank you. I'll start with you, Shan. And this is sort of interesting because this is where we tie things together and we are in sports, but we are looking at the broader society. And all of us know and we're close to, and I guess mentored by the late David Williams, the legendary athletic director at Vanderbilt. And I recently looked at a interview with David. It was an ESPN and some other sports legends. And he stated that change is not progress. And sometimes they'll see people in certain positions, people, Candice is this and Shane's doing that. And they say, this is change. But they confuse that with progress. And he says his point was making certain that progress and change are not confused. And we're seeing women, and particularly women of color, breaking into leadership roles. Candice, of course, the SEC, Miami Marlins, hiring the first Asian woman in the general manager. Why do you believe that David was pretty firm on saying we are seeing change, but progress was not change? I mean, change was not progress. And I'll start with Shane again.
Well, I think it goes back to the everyday experiences that are continuous, that are happening today, the same as they were happening 5, 10, 15, and 20 years ago, where an individual can be in a position and have perceivable power, but still be treated unfairly, but still have to deal with racism, still have to deal with microaggressions, still not be given the benefit of the doubt, even when they're in leadership positions. So in some cases, representation is absolutely important. Representation was the reason why I went to Vanderbilt, but it didn't stop the racist experiences that I had at Vanderbilt. So as we talk about change, there has been a lot of change. We are seeing people in positions that they hadn't been in before. We are seeing more people registered to vote. We are seeing more people being held accountable for their actions on a corporate level. But as it relates to true progress, that goes into us being able to change people's experience, right? So we have to go back and remember that it was law here in the United States that people who were folks of color were, what, 3/5 a human? That was it. That was in writing. And we like to hide behind the word system, but there were people who made those decisions, right? We got to get to a place where we truly treat people as equal, as opposed to just saying that people are equal. Those are two different things. And it's not only in the boardroom, in corporate spaces, at universities, but it's also what we do in our personal lives. We will see real progress when on Facebook, as people are sharing their family vacation photos, that we see diversity there. We'll see progress when we see people sharing photos of family dinners at their kitchen table and there's diversity there, right? Because this kind of progress is preceded by building relationships. And I think that was a part of the reason why David shared what he did.
Candice?
I mean, I agree with everything that Shane said, and I really appreciate that you brought up David, Sharon, because he was such an important person to all of us and really influential in this work. And, you know, he did talk a lot about the difference between change and progress. And I think it's illustrated by, you know, I will not sit here and pretend to be able to talk about Perry Wallace in the way that Andrew can. He so beautifully told his story to the world, and David, and you know, David was instrumental in reconciling Perry with the university, and Andrew has continued to ensure that Perry's story stays alive always, and that's been tremendously important. But I think about Perry and I think about David. You know, it's diversity is Perry coming to Vanderbilt. But inclusion would have been Perry feeling comfortable and affirmed and supported in the space. And that didn't happen. And, you know, Andrew, again, he beautifully has told that story. But, you know, I had the good fortune and really just the privilege of accompanying David and Andrew when Perry was in hospice and literally on his deathbed. You know, I had certainly seen him from afar and knew of this giant of a man. And we went into this hospice facility and he was still just so elegant and so regal, even in what were his last days. And he talked about coming to Vanderbilt. And I think he has said many times before that if he had to do it over again, he doesn't think he would. It was really hard. And some of the things that he talked about, I'm telling you, those experiences, some people are still experiencing that. It may look a little different, right, in how it plays out. But you know, I love that we have pioneered in many ways, but we have to affirm people. And we have to make sure that they have the tools that they need to succeed. You know, so I can invite you to my house, but if I don't make you feel comfortable at the dinner table, it doesn't matter. And that's what David would say all the time. So change is fine, but if it does not lead to progress, then what are we doing it for?
Mhm.
Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with what, of course, what Shane and Candice said, and I don't want to diminish the importance of Candice becoming the athletic director at Vanderbilt, you know, or Perry becoming the first Black player in the SEC, or you mentioned Kim Eng with the Miami Marlins. I mean, I think that is important. The alternative is that those things don't happen, but I guess what it points out is that you know, an individual in a position doesn't necessarily change the systemic issues that remain, you know. And so if you say that there's a systemic issue in policing, or, you know, in the United States, the fact that there's a Black police chief in a certain city, that doesn't affect, you know, that doesn't change the reality of the systemic racism that, you know, still permeates the whole business. And so I think you still see that in sports. Perry recognized that when his career came to an end at Vanderbilt, and a lot of people wanted to point to the fact that there was one Black player in the SEC as this major sign of progress, and say, okay, we've done that. We don't really have to explore it, you know, or learn from this situation and make it easier and better for the people that will come behind Perry, you know. And so he sat down with the Tennessean and told the hard truth about how difficult his experience was, so that opportunity wouldn't be lost to educate people. I think that the danger in change is people can point to it as too much, as progress more than really exists. So you saw that with the Supreme Court, right? Getting rid of some of the voting rights protections, saying that the country had changed, you know. And I think you see it a lot in politics, where it gives an excuse to people who really don't want to see the change or see the progress, to point to some of the changes and say that the progress is unnecessary, that it's already been achieved.
I know, and one of the things that I see pointed to quite a bit, and I've had a lot of conversations with various people in the community, is on this one issue, and it deals with, you know, Colin Kaepernick kneeling, and there have been such a divisive issue from what was really such, I think, a very profound act. And I was told that how could people, especially like me, who've gone to Vanderbilt and got both 2 degrees from the school, and being, you know, a child of a child that got 2 degrees at Vanderbilt, they seem to believe that somehow why would I not be very grateful to the United States? There's this whole idea that somehow these actions showing that you have been treated unjustly was making you not appreciate all the privilege that you have had in this country. And I think part of what I think that we need to have in this conversation is an understanding how, despite that privilege, you have a Perry Wallace believing that he may not have done it again. Because I think that sometimes there's a lack of understanding of the scars that result from going through a very challenging country and making it seem easy. So Andrew, we're not going to our later question. What effect do these scars have, and why is there the lack of appreciation for the scars that racism leaves with those who have been able to survive?
Great question. And I think that, you know, and that the term you used about, you know, you should you're ungrateful, right? Perry was called ungrateful when he gave that interview to the Tennessean, by people that thought that just the fact that he was, you know, quote unquote, allowed to come to Vanderbilt, right? As if he wasn't just as important part of this campus as anyone else, but he was allowed to come here, should be grateful for every aspect of that experience. When that experience on his own campus in his own hometown was more difficult, he said, than going to Starkville, Mississippi, to play a basketball game as the only Black person in the entire gym, where he's concerned that he might get shot just for stepping onto the court. But he said the most difficult part of his experience was on this campus, and the isolation and the loneliness that he experienced every day, not just during basketball season or 2 games a week during basketball season, but every day for 4 years. And so when he would say that he wasn't sure he would do it again, he said it was because he knew how fine that line was between making it and not making it through that experience, mentally and physically, you know, and what it took out of an 18, 19, 20-year-old kid to be put in this position of challenging centuries of segregation and racism, you know. And The second African-American basketball player in the SEC, Henry Harris at Auburn, committed suicide a few years after leaving Auburn. And Perry said, you know, he could see the direct line between that experience as a pioneer and those scars that you're talking about. And so that's one of the things I tried to really show in the book is, you know, we tend to celebrate Jackie Robinson. We celebrate Perry Wallace as pioneers for changing things for the benefit of the entire society. But what was the cost of pioneering and the toll on these pioneers that lasts forever?
Very much so. And Candice, I think about the Bill Russell effect. Athlete won championships, brought glory to his city. But he was not treated well by the city that he brought glory to. Okay, Candice.
Yeah, you know, I would just add, you know, my husband showed me an interview clip, an interview that Bill Duke did. I think I'm saying his name right. I certainly apologize if I'm not, but he, if you're not familiar with him, he was the first Black director on Dallas, which we know Dallas is a, you know, rich white family. And it was a big deal that he was asked to do this work. And so they interviewed and they said, man, what was that like? And he talked about, and I'm probably gonna mess up the quote, but it was very profound. And he said, well, when you break glass, right, when glass shatters, you get cut. And I think we don't talk a lot about that. So there is absolutely no doubt that when you get the opportunity, whether you're a David Williams or you're a Candice Lee or a Shan or whoever, right, you get a chance to be in a position that has not been occupied before by somebody that looks like you, that you appreciate it, you know, you earned it. It makes sense. But to think that that means that there are no issues that come with that there is not a physical and a mental toll on you is just ridiculous. Because the number of things, and sometimes they're small things. I mean, you know, there's a deputy athletic director on our staff who is African-American, Christine Kelly. She's a tremendous professional. She's wonderful. She gets called Candice 5 times a week because people can't tell us apart, I guess. Jerry Stackhouse has a woman on his staff, Adele Harris, chief of staff. Adele's about, I don't know how tall Adele is, but I'm much taller than her. She gets called Candice all the time. She did tell me she got a free meal at Bricktops because of it. So perhaps there are some good things, but because people are not even taking the time, that's ridiculous. That seems like a small thing, but it's not. It's ridiculous. You know, I can recall before I became the athletic director, being the deputy, I was the deputy athletic director at that time. We had a football game and we were up on the suite level. And, you know, if you're familiar with the suite level, there are a lot of donors up there, and it's an opportunity to sort of engage with donors and alumni and cultivate relationships. Presents a wonderful opportunity. And I was walking to our suite. I had just been talking to David, and then I walked to our suite, and a woman stopped me and asked me, I'm sure you work here. She said, the bathrooms need to be stocked. And I said, I'm sorry. And she's like, yeah, aren't you here to stock the bathrooms? I was like, no, ma'am. I'm probably here to ask you for some money, but I'm not going to ask you anything now. But I work here as the deputy athletic director. There's nothing wrong with stocking bathrooms. But there's a bunch of people up here, and you made the assumption that that was my job. Now that wasn't that long ago, and that's 3 degrees and 2 decades later. And those are the kinds of things. And unfortunately, those experiences are not uncommon. And so scars, yeah. Now, at the end of the day, if it means that there will be like a second and a third and a fourth and a fifth and a sixth, you know, then that's great. That's why you're doing it. You know, I listen to Kevin Warren, and I'm sorry for being long with the answer. I'll wrap up after this, but Kevin Warren he's the commissioner of the Big Ten, and he's the first Black commissioner, I think for sure in Power 5, but I mean, I'm sure he's setting many records with that role. I don't know him personally, but was on a Zoom call with him a couple of weeks ago, and he said, listen, so for those of us who are in these pioneering roles, it's not fun and it's not fair, so don't expect it to be. And as long as you understand that, You figure out how to find your joy. You figure out how to create what's meaningful for you and your family. But at no point is it going to be fun or fair. And that was quite sobering for me to hear. I understand it, but it was sobering.
Mhm. You know, and I think about you all the time, Candice, because I have this little 3 women that I keep in my head, and these are women that stepped into leadership roles. And I knew when they stepped in there, I knew it was going to be tough. And I've told one of them, I said, you know, this is what you prepared for.
Mm-hmm.
It was going to be tough because I've stepped in there myself.
Mm-hmm.
It's tough on the best of days,
Mm-hmm.
but I consider it a privilege to serve and to be that person that steps through there the first time. And it comes in really some of the most unusual places,
Mm-hmm.
but it's real and it does take its toll on you on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll go to Shane.
You know, just last week, I had a moment where I was experiencing what I perceived to be racism. And I called a friend of mine who just retired from the Metro Airport. And it's a Black woman who I have a lot of respect for, and a friend of mine. And I said, I just need to vent. I just need to let it out. And at the end of that conversation, she reminded me, she said, Shane, you're doing phenomenal things, but I need you to remember, you're still Black. I know you went to Vanderbilt. I know everybody respects what you're doing and you got a lot of support and you're making tremendous difference all around Nashville and all around the world. But what you're experiencing, you have to remember you're still Black. And unfortunately, until this changes, people are going to treat you like you're still Black. I sat there with tears in my eyes because it's the truth. That as Candice just said so well, just because you've attained a certain title, especially when you're one of the first, there are scars. And it happens just about every single day. You know, I think about, as we were talking about, you know, the Kaepernick kneeling and so many athletes kneeling and protesting. And so much of folks were saying that this was just disrespectful to the flag and to our military. And my grandfather, who I talk about in my book and just has been a phenomenal influence and impact on my life, served in our military. And when I talked to him about his experience serving in the military, what he wanted me to understand was that while they were overseas fighting for this country, they were like brothers. They were family. They were leaning and depending on each other. Race didn't matter. Color didn't matter. Size didn't matter. Background, where you were from, nothing else mattered except for helping each other survive. But he said the moment he stepped foot back on American soil, that they were separated. And people spat in his face, the same ones who had embraced him and loved on him. And he said, Shane, this is not about the military. This is about the heart of America and where we've always been. It's hurtful. It hurts for one to say that I'm protesting injustice and someone else say, no, you're disrespecting the flag. Mm-hmm. That's hurtful. When I think about the work that we're doing at the YW to end violence against women and girls, when it comes to domestic violence, no one is going to tell their daughter that they got to show proof of what happened to them. Nobody's going to tell their daughter that what you're saying is not valid and not true and make it something else. But when it comes to this issue of race, there are those who feel empowered to change the narrative because they can. And until we're able to not just have conversations about these things, but actually do what David Williams was talking about and moving to progress to where it changes the experience of people of color in this country, we're still going to have to carry this hurt. And in a lot of ways, it's this hurt and this pain that we have to use as motivation to do as my friend told me to do after she reminded me that I'm Black. She said, Shane, don't you dare give up. Don't you dare stop fighting. That's what it takes.
Okay, we're getting some questions, but before I get to those, one of the questions brought to mind an experience that I had. Another student, she was in a younger class than me, but we were at Vanderbilt together, Kathy Bender, who was a student athlete, storied athlete at Vanderbilt, and I were on a panel for the Women's Center at Vanderbilt. It's some anniversary of the Women's Center, and Kathy and I were on this panel. And this shows you kind of the pain and the mask that African-American or Black women have to carry with them for the rest of their life. She's been very successful, but they asked us about our experience at Vanderbilt. And Kathy had been really a big deal in high school. She's a big deal at Vanderbilt, but Vanderbilt didn't appreciate the same way her high school. So she came into that as, I got this. I'm an athlete, I'm a student. And she said Vanderbilt almost broke her. The psychology of being mistreated after you have been really a very achieved person, because every Black person that came to Vanderbilt then, and even to this day, has been a real superstar in their high schools. And go into that environment that was so painful and so discriminatory. You were okay at that time with your, the women on the basketball team somewhat, but that environment was so harsh. And she and I both experienced that in different ways, but it wasn't until I was on that panel I saw the emotion coming to her. This was how many years later? This was many years later. Mm-hmm. How that pain is within you. When you think about it, I talked to my other classmates from Vanderbilt. Now I want to just dog out, because we all love Vanderbilt.
Right.
All are realistic in how that left us with a lot of pain. And that's something that the university really has to look at. So going forward, and I'll start with you, Shane, what can organizations, any university, because we see even the NCAA tournament this year, athletes, if you don't perform well, people get angry at you, especially a Black person. We gave you the opportunity to come to our school and here we are losing this game. It's because you don't try hard enough. They're the derogatory negative comments made toward athletes when they don't perform up to the level they feel as though they should. What would be your call to action to this audience to make them see what can we do so that we don't have our athletes going into this hostile environment, so we have an appreciation in our community for what the athletes are going through when they are not your entertainment? And I'll start with you, Shane.
Well, I think it's really about reconnecting our heads with our hearts and seeing that we're all the same. Maya Angelou said that we are more alike than we are unalike. And it's true. But we got to do a better job of living out the values and the morals that we say we stand behind, irrespective of color, of race, of ethnicity, of religion, of all of those protected classes. We got to be able to start to treat each other better. So my call to action is really for us collectively to make not just a pledge, but a commitment to treat people better on an individual level. Because if we can treat each other better on an individual level, it will transform how we treat people collectively. That's in a corporate environment, that's at home, that's in our community. If we begin to treat each other better, it will transform how we treat people collectively.
Mm-hmm.
And Candice?
Yeah, I think I certainly agree with what Shane said, and I would say I would piggyback and just say a couple things. Like I think we can all make the commitment, right, to question status quo. Just question it. I mean, there are some things that are just so deeply entrenched and ingrained that if we could start to look at it with a questioning eye and at least be open to discussion, I do think it starts there, right? I think that can certainly spark something. Some people may be familiar with who Carla Williams is. She's actually the first Black female athletic director in Power 5, and somebody I consider a dear friend and a mentor, and she is just an unbelievable professional. One of the things that Carla says all the time when people say, like, what can we do? How can we fix this? And particularly people who identify themselves as allies, right? So I want to be part of this change. She'll say, well, so one thing you can do is when you hear your friends making the inappropriate jokes, the inappropriate comments, how about we intervene in the moment? Right? So how about in the moment, we call something out? So some of this is like learned behavior. We're going to have to relearn some things. We're going to have to question status quo. We're going to have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. I think sometimes we get caught up in like, what kind of training and what are these high level things? And, Shane very clearly articulated, like, it's just simple. This is about seeing people for who they are and treating them appropriately. We've had a number of panels, as I know everyone has, at Vanderbilt, and on a particular panel, this was all Vanderbilt employees, but there's a gentleman named Franklin Ellis who shared something that I had never heard, but I thought it was beautiful. He talked about the golden rule, which I think we all know is treating people the way you want to be treated. And he said, but I would actually encourage you to abide by the platinum rule, treating people the way they want to be treated. And I've never heard that, but it's like simple and beautiful. If we all did that, the shift would be monumental.
Okay, Andrew.
In terms of calls to action, I think a couple of just real practical ground level things some people can do. I think if you're someone that supports the idea of student athletes using their voice to protest for racial justice, let them know. I think they're hearing a lot from the other side, and I think it would be very encouraging to them to know that there are people out there that are supportive of them. Let Candice know that you support what she's doing. Let Shane know you support him. Read his book. You can listen, and learning from people, I think, is the most basic thing that people can do. I would recommend a podcast called the Black Athlete Podcast that Derek White and Lou Moore host. They're both professors. It's a terrific podcast. People would learn so much from that. There's a podcast called Burn It All Down, which is a feminist sports podcast. If you're interested in women's rights issues as they relate to sports, I would recommend that. We have the Sports and Society program at Vanderbilt. Follow us on Twitter. Email me. I'll put you on our newsletter. We share 5 stories a week that relate to race and gender and sports and politics. So there's a number of practical things that people can do to become more educated and empathetic on these issues. And then the last thing, when was the last time you've been to a women's sporting event? I would ask many people watching this. If you say that those issues matter, go support those athletes. Support the Black athletes that are stepping up and protesting racial injustice. Let them know.
That's good.
Okay, and we've gotten a lot of questions, but we always like to leave. We have a little time for Q&A. We've gotten several of them, and one of them is an issue that's recently come up, and I don't even think we know all of the facts that were involved. I know all we know is social media. Social media is so quick and so irregular and sometimes so wrong that you may not know all the facts. But this was the disparity in treatment for men and women at the NCAA basketball tournament with the weight room. Now that seems like, if you look at it, that's a small issue. Why is it a big deal? But being a woman, we call it intersectionality. I'm Black and I'm a woman, but I am a woman. And it seemed unfair on its surface. And maybe the three of you could enlighten me on how we are at the NCAA tournament and the treatment of disparity of treatment between the female and the male athletes as far as the weight room, given that we may not know all the facts. And I'll start with you, Andrew.
All right, Candice and I were just talking about this in the office last week and just seeing the videos. And I think that was the most interesting part of it to me was, in that case, you had women's basketball players that were using TikTok and Twitter to let the whole world know about these inequities, you know, which have been there forever. You know, it'll be the 50th anniversary of Title IX next year. So these inequities between men's and women's sports have always been there, but you know, there was always this gatekeeper of maybe the sports media, which was typically middle-aged or older white males who maybe didn't really care about those inequities, you know, or certainly weren't going to be writing about them. But now you have the platform of the student athletes themselves that can reach millions of people and point out so quickly how obvious those disparities were. I think Candice probably has more insight into how the NCAA works. But one thing we were talking about was it was obvious inequity, but were the people who were running the men's tournament and the people who were running the women's tournament even communicating with each other? You know, were they even aware that there would be this obvious difference in the way that the athletes were being treated? And if they weren't, that's quite an indictment too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, Candice.
Yeah, I agree with what Andrew said. And I think what's interesting is that, and you're right, Sharon, we don't have all the facts, but, you know, rarely is something just about one thing, right? So there was a TikTok video and people were outraged, and it seemed rightfully so. But then it sparked so much more discussion about just how female student athletes are treated. And I think I was most alarmed by the reactions on social media, that many people were like, what is the big deal? Why is this even a thing? And they rationalized it. And, you know, I think that young people will be the ones that actually get us to the point of progress, because they are not accepting of status quo. We all understand, like, they don't care. They don't need to have all the facts. They don't need to understand context. And, you know, in our jobs like that, sometimes that makes for some challenging days, but they don't care. They want to see action. They want to see it immediately. And regardless of where you stand in this, it's like there was a young woman who does a TikTok video, and the TikTok video led to real change. It did. You know, you got student athletes that are saying, so Mark, to the president of the NCAA, like, so what you going to do about this? And he's calling meetings, he's sending letters. We got an email today about an independent review of all championships. It's because this young woman used TikTok. And then it brought up all of these issues that, again, questioning status quo, because there are a lot of things that we just go through the motions and we accept it. Well, for all of us who are leaders in this space, you got to stop doing that. And if you can't figure it out on your own, these young people will make sure that you do. And so in some ways, as challenging as it is some days, you know, right? As challenging as it may be, they are going to force us. They're going to force change. And I mean, I think that that's actually pretty exciting, because I think that no matter what, even with all the experiences all of us have been through, there's still that part of you that does accept some bit of status quo. You sort of resolve yourself to it, because you got to figure out how to keep getting up in the morning. These young people say, I don't care how you figure it out, just as long as it changes. And so perhaps there's a lot of good that's going to come from that. But I will say, as someone who obviously was a Division I student athlete and played in the NCAA tournament for 5 years, there are inequities that do need to be addressed. And it may not be because people have intentionally caused them, but there are some things that need to be addressed. And so if we can put our personal feelings aside, this can be a great opportunity.
Yeah, because they have had the change of when the women rode the bus and the boys took the plane, but we're still a lot of work to do.
Have work to do.
Okay, Shane, I'll let you close us out.
Well, I think, and certainly just want to echo what Andrew and Candice have shared already, and kind of piggyback a little bit and just say that how we've always done it is no longer an acceptable answer. That we have to start asking why, and is it serving us well today, right? I can't tell you how many organizations, how many companies are literally acting and behaving based off of historical reference, irrespective to what was happening when those things were put into place. We have some organizations who in 35 years have not addressed their bylaws.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at what was happening 35 years ago and the inequities that were present, there's obviously some blind spots. There's obviously some spaces where we're unintentionally being oppressive, unintentionally being exclusive instead of inclusive. And we got to start asking the question, why? Why are we doing things the way we're doing them? And is there an opportunity for change? And if we're comfortable, if we can become comfortable with that bit of uncomfortable, then we can see real progress. And guess what? Everybody wins. As we continue to raise up those who have been marginalized, the opportunities for us all to progress and go after more and better are exponential. Absolutely. When you push past discomfort, you always find greatness. And I'm going to leave with this last quote that just simply says, you have to change what people see until they see something different. That's what this change is about. We have to change what people see until they begin to see things differently.
Well, thank you so much, this panel. As always, I knew when we established it, we would exceed our expectations. But I'll leave you with this thought. When you know better, you can do better. So we won't dwell on all the past, and I know everyone has suffered a lot of pain, but all I ask is that now that we know better, let's do better. Mm-hmm. And so I thank all of you and thank all of our audience for participating in the YWCA Stand Against Racism. Hopefully you've learned something and you're better informed. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.